Popular.com.
Husband of slain woman says, "No idea who killed my wife," by James F. Atkins. September 26th, 1940. I don't have any idea who killed my wife. I told District Attorney Smiley that, and he said that he believes me. She was as good a woman as a man could want. She was a good mother and a good housekeeper, and our two boys were dressed as carefully and cared for as lovingly as any two children in the world. On Saturday, I had to work at Baldwin's, and I left the house at 7 o'clock in the morning. She left the house about 8:15, wearing a blue polka dot dress. She didn't take any coat or hat, and she left her pocketbook on the table, so I know she didn't intend to go very far or stay very long. When I got home about 5:15, one of our boys said, "Daddy, Mummy's gone downtown. Are we going down to meet her?" I told him, "No, we'll wait here for her. She'll be home soon." Of course, I had to work Monday and Tuesday. I was getting pretty worried, or maybe you'd just say puzzled. Tuesday night, though, I decided to talk to the police over at 26th and York Streets. I was going to go over Tuesday night, but I met an officer I know, and he said, "Let it go tonight, Jim, and then if she hasn't turned up by tomorrow, you can come over to the station and report her missing." The next morning, I got up at 6 o'clock and I went down to get the milk and the paper, the Inquirer, by the way. I picked it up and ran my eye over the headlines, the way a fellow will, and I saw this story about a woman being murdered. I was just glancing through it when I saw that this woman had been wearing a blue polka dot dress and a pink slip, which my wife had been wearing. I didn't know just what to do, but I called up a friend of mine and he drove me up to Willow Grove. We saw a police officer and he asked me what initials were on my wife's wedding ring. I told him JFA to EMA. He said, "That's right, those are the initials." Then we went over to Abington Hospital, and my friend went to identify her in the place where she was. I couldn't do it. I sort of broke down, but I didn't want to see her that way. Then I talked to some county detectives who took me over to District Attorney's office. He sure is a nice man. He talked to me just as kindly and gentlemanly as you'd want any man to talk to you. Of course, he asked me all about my wife and myself, things like that, and I told him everything I knew. I hope this is cleared up, because if it isn't, it's going to be tough on the kids. You know, a thing like that is a cloud over me and the boys, too. My wife was a good woman, and if they find the man and I meet him, well, him and me are going to have an argument right there. True Crime Historian presents An Eye for an Eye, a special edition of yesterday's news exploring the criminal justice system at its most extreme, inflicting the death penalty. Episode 301 is an especially sordid tale, and I don't believe all of the lurid details were revealed, although many of them were hinted at as police and people who knew the victim inadvertently reveal uncomfortable truths about her, even as they try to protect her dignity. But I think she just went on a bender and things took a dark, fatal turn. What do you think? I'm true crime historian Richard O. Jones, and for your scandalization and indignation, I give you A Fatal Drinking Party. The brutal murder of Ethel May Atkins. Philadelphia, September 25th, 1940. The nude body of an auburn-haired woman, about 30 years old, was found last night in a vacant farmhouse on Dreshertown Road near the Horsham-Montgomeryville Road, Horsham Township. Apparently bludgeoned to death, the woman, as yet unidentified, was sprawled on the staircase leading to the second floor, where spattered bloodstains and a heavy club were discovered. A blue polka-dot dress and a pink slip were on the ground floor. Police hoped to establish identity of the woman through a white gold wedding ring on her finger, which bore the inscription JFA to EMA, September 30th, 1935. The gruesome discovery was made by John C. Brady of Willow Grove as he and his wife were about to show the place to Mr. and Mrs. Charles Leo of Horsham, prospective tenants. The house had been vacant about a month. It was just about dusk when Brady, the owner, drove in the lane with his wife and the Leos, still light enough, however, for them to notice a broken window in one of the second-floor rooms. Thinking that vagrants might be in the house, Brady asked the others to surround the place, while he climbed up a post of the back porch, pulled himself onto the roof, and stepped in through another window. In 2 of the 4 rooms upstairs, bloodstains bore mute testimony to a terrific struggle. Shocked and faint, Brady looked downstairs to see a crumpled body, clad only in white shoes and stockings. Meanwhile, made impatient by the delay, the Leos took the key from Mrs. Brady and let themselves in the front door. They found the blue polka-dot dress and a slip lying on a davenport in the living room. But before they came face to face with the body, Brady escorted them out. State motor police of the Doylestown Barracks were notified immediately by telephone, and they in turn called Montgomery County detectives, who took charge of the case. The detectives found the woman's clothing without a rip or tear. They found a gold wedding ring on her finger. She weighed about 140 pounds, stood 5 feet 6 inches, but no one in the neighborhood could recall having seen a woman of that description, nor could anyone living nearby recognize the dress. Upstairs, where the only article of furniture was a broken-down iron bed, detectives found a blood-stained club about 3 feet long by 1.5 inches in diameter. The heavy end was split, indicating the viciousness of the use to which it had been put. Whether the woman had been the victim of a criminal attack before she was slain was not immediately determined, but the head was smashed, the lower lip almost cut off, and 2 teeth knocked out. Dr. John C. Simpson, Montgomery County Coroner's physician, said the woman had been dead at least 6 hours. Coroner Rushong said he thought the woman had come to the house sometime during the day, either with a man or to meet one there. It was not apparent at first glance why there should have been a fatal struggle. Detectives said there was nothing to indicate that the woman had been using the house as a shelter. Chief County Detective K. Munchauer said he believed the woman started downstairs to escape the rain of blows from the heavy club, then fell and was killed as she lay on the steps. It did not seem likely she was slain upstairs and thrown there. The body was removed to Abington Memorial Hospital for a formal autopsy today. September 26, 1940. While state troopers and Montgomery County detectives last night were searching for an unnamed man for questioning in connection with the murder of Mrs. Ethel Kraft Atkins, 38-year-old Philadelphia housewife, District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley strongly hinted that she may have met her death while wandering in one of the chronic seizures of amnesia to which she had been subject for almost 20 years. While admitting that he expects a quick break in the case, the 3rd murder of that character in the county during his tenure, he specifically declined to discuss the search for the subject. Quote, "I'd rather not talk about that." He gave a resume of developments in the case just before midnight after John Cicero Angier of Baltimore, divorced first husband of Mrs. Atkins, had been subjected to more than 2 hours of intensive questioning. He was released, and though asked by the prosecutor to keep himself available, it appeared obvious that he had been cleared of any suspicion of complicity in the crime. Both Angier and the dead woman's second husband, James F. Atkins, of 2348 North Opal Street, disclosed, Smiley said, that she had been subject to periods of amnesia. She suffered 5 such attacks during her first marriage between 1921 and 1928, he said Angier disclosed, 5 during her second, according to Atkins. The most recent, according to Atkins, was in 1938 when she wandered away from home and was found eventually by police in an automobile in Fairmount Park, unharmed but without the slightest recollection of where she had been or what she had done in the interim. Both Angier, who is a second cousin of Mrs. Doris Duke Cromwell, heiress to the Duke tobacco millions, and Atkins insisted, Smiley said, that the dead woman was, quote, a really good woman, unquote, and both expressed great admiration for her. Mrs. Atkins bore 3 children by her first marriage. The children, Donald, 18, Lyda May, 17, and Newton, 16, now reside with Angier's mother in the ancestral home at Durham, North Carolina. She also had twin sons by her second marriage, Johnny and Jimmy, 3.5 years old. Her all but nude body, clad only in silk hose and 1 white shoe, was found slumped at the foot of the staircase in a ramshackle house on Drescher Road near Welsh Road, 3 miles northeast of Willow Grove, at 7:30 p.m. Tuesday by James C. Brady, owner of the house, who was preparing to show it to prospective tenants. Mr. and Mrs. Brady were questioned again last night to further clarify the circumstances under which the gruesome discovery was made. Angier arrived with his counsel after they were questioned. Aside from what authorities may know concerning the relationship of the supposed victim to the crime, the only other known clue is a series of 3 fingerprints found on a fragment of a broken pane of glass in a front window of the house. Although a cobweb across the window suggested that this was not the method of obtaining entrance on Tuesday, investigators reasoned that Mrs. Atkins' assailant might have entered it several days previously by breaking a window in order to prepare it for a rendezvous. The district attorney said that Angier told him that he married Ethel M. Kraft on April 2, 1921, and that he last saw her on May 9, 1928, after which they separated. He said that there had been no communication of any kind between them since that time. Angier's last trip to the city, he said, was on January 8, 1940, when he appeared before Charles E. Kenworthy as master in his divorce action against Mrs. Angier, who, for more than 3 years at that time, had been Mrs. Atkins. Angier remarried April 29th of this year, 8 days after his divorce decree became final. Smiley said that Angier told him that the first Mrs. Angier herself instituted suit for divorce on grounds of cruel and barbarous treatment in June 1928, but that the case apparently had been dropped. Smiley said that the dead woman's first husband explained that his mother, Lyda May Angier, was a cousin of Benjamin Duke, one of the founders of the huge Duke tobacco empire, thus placing him in the relationship of second cousin to Mrs. Cromwell, wife of the former U.S. Minister to Canada, now Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate from New Jersey. City Hall court records show that Ethel M. Kraft, who gave her age as 35 and her occupation as waitress, and James F. Atkins, a brick pointer, obtained a license to wed on September 28, 1935, and that they were married 2 days later by Reverend William J. Walters. Apparently, the former Mrs. Angier did not obtain a divorce prior to marrying Atkins, so far as court records indicate, for on March 2, 1938, Angier instituted suit for divorce in Common Pleas Court No. 4 on the grounds of desertion. Mrs. Angier, as the respondent, could not be served. A new subpoena was issued May 13, 1938, and on April 12, 1940, slightly over 5 months ago, a final decree was handed down. The court indicated that efforts to serve Mrs. Angier were fruitless. Records of Angier's divorce action do not disclose why his application was delayed almost 9 years following separation from his wife. He said that after their marriage, he and his wife lived in various places in the city where he was employed by an engineering concern, presumably Day and Zimmerman. His testimony related that in May 1928, he was employed with the concern in construction of the new Eastern State Penitentiary at Graterford. One day, when he returned home, he found, the testimony stated, that his wife had gone to live with friends in Logan. He found her, urged her to return to him, but she refused. Aside from the facts disclosed by the autopsy performed by Dr. John C. Simpson, Montgomery County coroner's physician, that the woman bled to death from internal hemorrhage, while at the same time probably frantically dashing about the second floor of the abandoned home in an effort to escape from a club-wielding assailant. County detectives and state motor police admitted to but few clues. As was her custom, Mrs. Atkins made her husband's breakfast prior to his leaving Saturday at 7 a.m. by automobile for Essington, where he is employed as a bricklayer on the maintenance staff of the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It was not until he returned late that afternoon, he told Smiley, that he learned from his wife's uncle, Titus Barrymore, 65, who came to their home for a visit on Friday, that Mrs. Atkins had left the house at about 8:15 a.m. She did not wear a hat or coat and did not carry a pocketbook, which was taken to indicate that she had no intention of leaving for an extended period. From neighbors, police learned that voices raised in violent argument had been heard Friday night at the Atkins home. Barrymore said that he heard the sounds of argument, but whether he was able to give any further information was not disclosed. It was not until Tuesday night, according to Atkins, that he became worried about his wife's absence and determined to report her as missing to the police. However, a police officer, a friend of his, urged him not to make report until Wednesday morning. Yesterday morning, however, Atkins read of the murder, noted that the murdered woman had been wearing a blue polka dot dress, and suspected that it might be his wife. A friend drove him to Willow Grove, and from police it was learned that the dead woman's wedding ring was that of Mrs. Atkins. Her husband was so unnerved that his friend made the formal identification at Abington Memorial Hospital morgue. Atkins was then taken to Norristown for questioning. After some hours of questioning, in which he was given a complete physical examination by Dr. Simpson, including microscopic examination of parings from underneath his fingernails, he was released. Smiley told him, however, to remain on call if needed. How or with whom Mrs. Atkins went to the unfurnished house on Drescher Road, whether she went there deliberately or was lured, Smiley professed not to know. The autopsy disclosed that she had sustained 3 severe lacerations of the scalp, but that none had fractured the skull. Her face was badly bruised, and there were indications that a sharp instrument had slashed her chest and had been plunged into the body. Support your favorite podcaster at www.patreon.com/truecrimehistorian. Just $1 a month reserves your bunk at the safe house and gives you access to exclusive content and whatever personal services you require. September 27th, 1940. In attempting to trace the movements of Mrs. Ethel Craft Atkins during the 84-hour period ending in her brutal murder Tuesday afternoon, investigators yesterday adopted the tentative theory that she was drugged and taken semi-conscious in an automobile to the lonely 100-year-old house on Dreschertown Road, where her body was found. While behind the scenes, Montgomery County authorities and state police are understood still to be pressing a search for a definite suspect, the bulk of their visible effort yesterday was concentrated on tracing her movements during the period of her absence from home. Developments in the investigation of the murder yesterday included 1. The belief that the woman's slayer used a car and may have scouted the neighborhood in selecting a rendezvous in anticipation of its use for criminal assault. 2. Certainty that the crime was committed during daylight hours, as the house is not wired for electricity and there is no evidence that any other means of illumination had been employed. 3. Intensive investigation both in this city and the vicinity of the crime by joint details of Montgomery County detectives and state police investigators. 4. Disclosure in the autopsy report given to District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley by Dr. John C. Simpson that death resulted from loss of blood due to multiple lacerations and cuts of the head and body inflicted by 4 weapons: a section of iron bedstead, a razor or razor blade, a 3-foot club, and a man's fist. And the conclusion from this and other evidence that the assailant may have been a slender, relatively small individual. Smiley disclosed that Mrs. Atkins was chronically addicted to intoxicants. Aside from this weakness, he said, both of her husbands, John C. Angier, whom she left in 1928 and who finally divorced her in April of this year, and James F. Atkins, whom she married in 1935, described her as a fine woman, a good housekeeper, and a splendid mother. Both, it was learned, had stated positively that she resented immoral suggestions of any kind and, when drinking, often flew into violent rages at any such suggestion. It is reasoned that her murderer, knowing this, may have approached her in a tap room sometime during her as yet untraced absence from her home, slipped knockout drops into her drink, and then, after the drug had taken partial effect, conducted her to a waiting automobile. Belief that a car was used came from numerous sources yesterday. Samuel H. High, former president of the Montgomery County Bar Association, lives on Dreshertown Road, approximately 1/4 of a mile south of the house where the crime was committed. His son Gilbert, former assistant district attorney of Montgomery County, told Smiley yesterday that he had seen an automobile parked in front of the vacant house at about 6:50 o'clock Sunday night. He said that he believed 2 persons were in the car, but that his wife disputed this, believing that there were 3. Reuben Anders, 12-year-old schoolboy who attends the Horsham Public School, told Smiley that when he was returning home from school on Tuesday afternoon, he saw a car driving slowly past the house. He emphasized that the car was going very slowly. None of the 3 witnesses could give any description of the car. Pursuing the tentative theory, it is believed that Mrs. Atkins' abductor, half carrying her, may have approached the house, broken a pane of glass in a large 4-pane front window, wriggled through, an act which a large man could not have done, unlocked the door from the inside, and entered with the woman. It is theorized that he may have disrobed her, leaving her dress and slip neatly folded on an old divan in the kitchen, and conducted her up the stairs to the bathroom, whose door he bolted behind him. Then, it is thought, the woman might have recovered from the effects of the drug sufficiently to realize her situation and promptly flown into a violent rage, frightening or arousing the man to the point where he began to attack her. That the furious struggle started in the bathroom is evident, police assert. The small room was literally soaked with blood. Apparently, the woman groped with bloody hands for the bolt of the door, finally disengaging it and fled into an adjoining bedroom. This room, too, was drenched with blood. Here, police found the end section of a small demountable iron bedstead, which obviously had been used to strike the woman at least once. Clotted blood and hair adhered to it. Finally, in one last conscious effort to elude her murderous pursuer, Mrs. Atkins stumbled to the head of the stairs leading down to the kitchen and slid down them in a sitting position. It was in this posture that her body was found by Charles Leo. The absence of blood in the vicinity of the body suggested, police said, that the woman literally bled to death in the 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. 29, 1940. Philadelphia police, shortly before 3 o'clock this morning, announced a solution of the brutal murder of Mrs. Ethel Kraft Atkins. William J. Ernest, 24, of North 17th Street near Diamond, a waiter in a diner, according to investigators, admitted the killing. According to Captain William Ingle of the Homicide Squad, Ernest signed a confession of the crime. However, at the time of Captain Ingle's announcement, no formal charge of murder was lodged against Ernest. Instead, both he and a companion said to have accompanied him to the scene of the murder were charged with being fugitives from Montgomery County. It is said that a homicide charge would not be lodged until Ernest was placed in the hands of Montgomery County authorities. The companion was named by Captain Ingle as Richard Brady, 24, of North Warnock Street near Somerset. The confession was obtained, investigators said, after the pair had been cross-examined for several hours. They were brought into the Detective Bureau, City Hall, for questioning after police had grilled 3 other men late yesterday and last night. The trail, which evidently led murder squad detectives Thomas Costello and Adam Sadorf to the 2 accused men, began early yesterday when mourners mumbled snatches of information concerning some of the last hours of the woman's life as they stood at her bier. The woman had last been seen alive by her husband on Saturday morning. According to Detective Captain Ingle, the confession of Ernest asserted that he and Brady met the woman in a tap room at 15th Street and Susquehanna Avenue at about 10 o'clock Tuesday morning. Neither he nor Brady, police said, he related, had ever seen Mrs. Atkins before. Subsequently on Tuesday, according to Ingle, the 3 visited at least 10 other tap rooms, according to the confession. Ingle said that Ernest admitted he was an acquaintance of Leon Evans, the last tenant of the Horsham house, and therefore knew it was unoccupied. Late in the day, Ingle said, the 2 men and Mrs. Atkins decided to go to the house. Ingle said, quote, he and Brady waited outside in the automobile, and that he and Atkins got into the house by breaking a window. A little later, according to his story, a fight started. He said that Mrs. Atkins got angry over some incident, threw a heavy object at him, and after that he could remember nothing of what happened. He said they were all drunk. The all-important break in the case, coming at an hour when weary police were at the point of admitting they had run into a blank wall, occurred at about 1 a.m. yesterday as James F. Atkins, husband of the dead woman, talked with the last of the mourners who had called at his home, 2348 North Opal Street, to view the body. In the room was one man whom Atkins did not know. His presence was hardly noted until, without warning, he was heard to mumble that he had been with Mrs. Atkins last Saturday. Atkins at once communicated with police at City Hall. Detectives raced to the house. Man number 1, as he was afterwards dubbed at City Hall, was taken to 8th and Jefferson Street Police Station, where an all-night questioning failed to satisfy the police. About 7:15 a.m., he was taken to City Hall, where he dictated a statement to a police stenographer, saying that he had been with Mrs. Atkins all day Saturday and until early Sunday morning, drinking at a tap room at Broad Street and Susquehanna Avenue, and later at a number of clubs. At an unknown hour Sunday evening, after a continual round of clubs, where man number 1 said he became very intoxicated and ran out of funds, he turned her over to man number 2. While man number 1, described as short, about 5 feet 5 inches tall, swarthy complexion, gray hair, bull-like neck, and wearing a blue pinstripe suit, was put in a cell on the 6th floor of City Hall, the search began for man number 2. It was only a few hours later that man number 2 put in a voluntary appearance with his attorney. They went immediately into a conference with Duffy and the others and told them man number 2 took Mrs. Atkins from man number 1 at the latter's invitation sometime late Sunday, spent the evening hours with her drinking at various clubs, and then turned her over to man number 3. According to the investigators, man number 3 accompanied her for a considerable period. His story and those of the other 2 led to the arrests of the 2 who were held this morning. At the same time, the funeral for the slain woman was being held at the home on North Opal Street, followed by burial in New Glenwood Cemetery. Despite the fast-breaking developments at City Hall, detectives watched closely the crowds attending both ceremonies and the chance that the killer might have been attracted there. More than 1,500 persons crowded outside the home before the services for a last chance to view the body, placed in a room banked high with flowers. An overflow of floral tributes were placed in an adjoining room. Atkins told police that man number 1 was one of the last to come to the home Friday night for the viewing. Apparently unacquainted with anyone in the room, he walked silently to the bier and stood there for several moments. Then he began mumbling, and between his words came the sound of sobs. Atkins began paying attention then, and a few seconds later, he said he heard the man say something about being with Mrs. Atkins last Saturday. Later, when man number 1 told police about the hours spent at the Broad Street and Susquehanna Avenue taproom last Saturday, it was recalled that Thomas Brennan, proprietor of the place, was one of 80 taproom owners questioned Friday as to whether the woman had been seen in any of them from the time she left home. At that time, Brennan, looking at the picture of the woman, said she had not been in his place. Yesterday, after man number 1's story had been told, he repeated his statement, declaring he did not know her and could not tell whether she had been there. September 30th, 1940. A 35-year-old ex-convict yesterday confessed that he murdered Mrs. Ethel Kraft Atkins. William J. Ernest of North 17th Street near Diamond, a cook in a North Philadelphia lunch wagon, was said by police to have admitted he killed the 38-year-old woman in an uncontrollable fit of rage, climaxing a wild orgy in the abandoned house in Horsham, where her body was found last Tuesday night. Police records show that Ernest had a record of 6 arrests extending back to 1921, most recently marked with a 3-month jail sentence he served in 1937 when he was convicted of a sexual perversion charge. In 1934, he served a similar sentence for stealing clothing and jewelry from a North Philadelphia home. In an alleged confession given to Philadelphia police, whose tireless work broke the case in the early hours yesterday, Ernest claimed that he had killed the woman in self-defense. Quote, "I lost my head when she started to attack me," unquote. Ernest, who is married and the father of 2 children, and a companion, Richard Brady, 24, who allegedly rode with him and Mrs. Atkins to the old house on Dreshertown Road where the killing occurred, were being held in City Hall cells. Technical charges of being fugitives from Montgomery County were placed against them. After hearings this morning in City Hall, they will be turned over to authorities from Montgomery County with formal charges to be filed in Norristown. Fingerprints of Ernest were sent to Norristown last night for comparison with those obtained in the house where Mrs. Atkins met her death. The arrest of Brady and Ernest, the latter a short-order cook in the Glenwood Diner, Broad Street and Glenwood Avenue, came at the direct result of the mutterings of a mourner at the bier of the dead woman early Saturday. Ernest's confession declared that he and Brady picked up Mrs. Atkins in a club on 20th Street near Montgomery Avenue about 9 a.m. Tuesday. With them was another woman who was dropped shortly afterward as Brady and Ernest set out on a tour of other clubs with Mrs. Atkins. Then came the fatal ride in the country, with the trio driving ultimately to the vacant house in Horsham, the township where Ernest had lived with his mother for several years, for a party. In his confession, Ernest said, quote, "The back door was locked, so I went around to the front, broke the window on the front porch, climbed into the living room, and then went to the back door and let Mrs. Atkins and Dick in. Ernest said Mrs. Atkins took off her clothes as soon as we got in the house. There followed a description of a wild party which ensued in the second-floor bedroom. Ernest said a quarrel started, at the height of which Mrs. Atkins made a remark that intensified his rage. Quote, "I cursed and lost my head. She grabbed a curtain rod and tried to strike me with it, and I grabbed it from her and hit her over the head with it and ran into the next room. She ran after me. While we were tussling in the back room, we tripped and fell, and the bottom of the iron bedstead fell over and struck her on the chest, cutting her. I picked the bedstead off of her and put it up against the wall. She got up and again started to attack me. She grabbed the stick again and tried to beat me with it, and I took it off her and hit her over the head again." Unquote. Ernest recounted that he raced down the stairs at that point, yelling to Brady, "Let's get out of here." Mrs. Atkins yelled, "You're not going to leave me here, I'm coming with you." And I ran out the back, Brady with me, jumped in my automobile and drove home, leaving Dick off at his house. Then I went home. I was dog-tired. Unquote. Brady's statement to the police corroborated Ernest's account of the slaying, except that Brady, a West Philadelphia gasoline station attendant, insisted he did not go into the house with Mrs. Atkins and Ernest. Quote, "When Ernest ran out of the house and got into the car, I asked him where the woman was. He said she had gotten tough and he had to clip her. Then we drove away." Unquote. Ernest's police record had its beginnings on September 21st, 1921, when he was arrested at the age of 16 on a charge of suspicion of larceny of an automobile. He was discharged. In 1925, he was arrested again, this time on a charge of reckless driving and speeding, and was fined $7.50, the only penalty he ever paid for his first 4 arrests. The third and fourth arrests came in Jersey City in 1926, only 2 days apart. He was arrested March 13th as a disorderly person, and on March 15th on a charge of stealing a rented car from Philadelphia. On the latter, he was held on a bail of $1,000, but the record showed no disposition of the case. Judge Harry S. McDevitt gave him his first 3-month sentence in 1934 when Ernest pleaded guilty to a theft charge, and Judge Frank Brown gave him another 3-month term in 1937 when he was arrested for attacking a 12-year-old boy. The almost endless string of drinking engagements kept by Mrs. Atkins during the weekend, culminating in the slaying, started with a 36-hour date with Thomas McDonough, 49, of 15th Street near Cumberland, who picked her up in a tap room at Broad Street and Susquehanna Avenue, and finally left her in a club near his home. Late Monday afternoon, she was picked up by Edward McNulty, 39, of Broad Street near Butler, staying with him only about 90 minutes before he left her at 7:15 p.m. in a tap room at 15th Street and Glenwood Avenue. There, police said, she was picked up by Adam Mascovian of Oakdale and his brother-in-law Russell Tracy of Sargent Street near 24th, and stayed with Mascovian until 8 a.m. Tuesday when he left her in the club where shortly afterward she met Ernest and Brady. Brady's date was Mrs. Catherine Leonard, 36, of Cheltenham Avenue near Broad Street. She stayed with them until 9:30 a.m., police said, when Brady, Ernest, and Mrs. Atkins took her home, left her, and started out with Mrs. Atkins. Ernest and Brady were seized by Detectives Costello and Sadorf of the Philadelphia Homicide Squad, which had worked on the case 24 hours a day under the direction of Captain William Ingle. Ernest is married to Winnie Ernest, 25, and has 2 children. She was allowed to see Ernest for a few minutes after detectives told her of his confession. She declared, quote, "He said he didn't do it. He whispered, 'Don't worry about me.' I can't believe that he did do it. He's always been kind to me. Why, to think that I told girls at the plant where I work that I would kill the murderer of Mrs. Atkins if I ever got my hands on him," she cried. She said her husband came home last Tuesday morning, telling her he had been drinking, and went right to bed. Mrs. Leonard, Brady's date, said Mrs. Atkins had been quiet all the time she was with the trio, just sat there and said nothing. Ernest, known throughout his neighborhood as Whitey, lived in Horsham Township for 4 years. He started working at the diner last Christmas, and friends said he led usually a good life, training regularly at the Germantown YMCA. October 1st, 1940. Trapped in a web of discrepancies during a reenactment of the crime, William J. Ernest, late yesterday, made a new and full confession that he alone was the brutal murderer of Mrs. Ethel Kraft Angier Atkins. It was announced by Montgomery County District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley. Smiley made the announcement outside the century-old house where the ghastly murder was perpetrated a week ago today. Ernest and the friend he had sought to implicate in the murder, Richard Brady, had just spent nearly 2 hours reenacting the slaying. A formal charge of murder was made against Ernest last night at a hearing before Justice of the Peace Harvey Slingluff, who held him and Brady charged with being an accessory after the fact without bail for the grand jury. The hearing, held in Slingluff's crowded living room, took only 10 minutes. When it was over, both men were rushed under heavy armed guard back to Norristown in the county jail. Ernest's story of the murder, as told at the house during the reenactment, had been reduced to writing, Gleason said. Back at the jail, Smiley said he was listing the case for trial the first week in November. Prison warden Fred R. Fluck put the two men in separate cells directly behind his office and said they would stay there until their trial. Smiley said, quote, Ernest admitted it was he who had beaten Mrs. Atkins to death. He still insists that Brady was in the house, and Brady still denies it. Ernest admitted, however, that Brady never struck the woman. I am convinced that Brady was not involved in the actual killing, but we're going to hold him as an accessory. The district attorney characterized the killings as, quote, one of the coldest killings I ever heard of, unquote, after Ernest had gone from room to room with Smiley and detectives in the old house, allegedly showing how he had killed the 38-year-old woman. Earlier at City Hall here, Ernest had changed the alleged confession he gave to police early Sunday by declaring that Brady had assaulted Mrs. Atkins after Ernest had left the house. Ernest told detectives at City Hall that Mrs. Atkins was only slightly hurt when he left Brady and the woman on the second floor. He accused Brady of continuing the vicious assault, ending in the death of the woman. It was because of his switch in the story that the men were not arraigned in Norristown yesterday afternoon. Smiley didn't know whom to charge with murder. The men were taken from City Hall to Norristown about noon, and there underwent about 3 hours of questioning by Smiley and his aides before the whole party got into 2 automobiles and drove to the house for the reenactment. Ernest was the first to be taken into the house. Handcuffed to Detective James Gleason, he showed the party of officers how he and Atkins had tried to enter the back door, found it locked, and then went to the front to gain entry by breaking a window. The handcuffs were then taken off Ernest. 4 detectives guarded each corner of the dwelling, and the suspect, Smiley, and others went inside. It took 37 minutes for Ernest, going from one blood-smeared room to another, to enact his grisly version of the sordid murder. Brady, who had been sitting in an automobile with 4 other officers, was called in, and for more than an hour he and Ernest were grilled separately and together. When discrepancy after discrepancy was pointed out by Smiley and Ernest's story, the lunch wagon cook allegedly broke down and made his complete admission of the crime. December 3rd, 1940. A verdict which will be just and proper for such a crime was asked by District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley yesterday in Montgomery County Criminal Court, Norristown, as William J. Ernest, 35-year-old cook, went on trial for the brutal slaying of Mrs. Ethel May Atkins. Several women spectators in the crowded courtroom gasped as the prosecutor, in a 15-minute opening address to the middle-aged jury of 7 women and 5 men, described the lurid details of the crime, which was discovered on September 24th when the woman's battered body was found in a lonely vacant farmhouse on Dreshertown Road, Horsham. "He beat her! He beat her! He beat her!" Smiley declared as the eyes of the jury turned to Ernest, who sat with his eyes closed, head bowed, chin almost resting on his chest. "He beat her with a club about the head, about the throat, about the body, until her life's blood poured out of her. Not only did he use this club, a curtain pole about 2.5 feet long, but he then took the iron bedstead as she lay on the floor and beat her head with it." Smiley told the jurors that we will produce the witnesses who will testify that Mrs. Atkins, while riding in the automobile which took her to the house wherein she was to die, sat as though in a trance or stupor. The murder occurred as the tragic climax to a wild drinking party. Although he did not specifically ask for a first-degree murder verdict during the questioning of prospective jurors, Smiley placed almost all of his emphasis on whether they would be willing to impose the death penalty. First witness called by the Commonwealth was James F. Atkins, 32, husband of the slain woman, who was the mother of twins, James and John, 3 years old. Atkins, who works at the Baldwin Locomotive Works, described his wife as one who was, quote, allergic to liquor. If she drank whiskey or beer, I would talk to her and she might not answer, as though she were in a stupor, unquote. Edward McGanola, friend of the family, described his identification of the body. Henry K. Bussa, Norristown photographer, who made photographs of the gruesome scene, presented 24 pictures, and they were admitted as evidence before court adjourned for the day at 5:05 p.m. Ernest, who lived on 17th Street near Diamond before his arrest, was dressed in a blue serge suit with a blue and white striped tie and black shoes and socks. Freshly shaven, he had recently had a haircut, and his hair was slicked back. His court-appointed lawyers, Gilbert P. High and William F. Fox, it is believed, will contend self-defense and drunkenness as their defense in the trial, at which Judge William F. Danahauer is presiding. December 4th, 1940. Whitey Ernest was cold sober the day he bopped Mrs. Ethel Atkins and wished aloud he had bopped her again. Such was the testimony of Richard Brady at Ernest's trial for Mrs. Atkins' murder. District Attorney Smiley, prepared to demand the death penalty, built up an insistence upon that sobriety to offset any move the defense might make to prove that Ernest was in a drunken rage at the time. The jury of 6 men and 8 women, including 2 alternates, heard Brady testify further that Mrs. Atkins, mother of 5 children and former wife of John Cicero Angier, tobacco heir, was in a daze during most of the early morning round of tap rooms which preceded the slaying. They heard from the 4th companion on that fatal day, September 24th, that Mrs. Atkins never seemed to say a word. The 4th companion was Mrs. Catherine Leonard. Added to her corroborative testimony was a declaration by the victim's husband, James P. Atkins, that Mrs. Atkins was allergic to liquor and lost her memory after a few beers. Ernest's probable defense was hinted in the testimony of his Assistant District Attorney Edward B. Duffy, who questioned the short-order cook after his arrest. Duffy told Judge William F. Danahauer and the jury that listened closely there in the packed Montgomery County courtroom that Ernest had claimed everything went black after the scuffle in the vacant farmhouse near Horsham. But Ernest said Brady wasn't drunk. Not long before the slaying, he had coffee and tomato juice, according to Brady, and he drove their car with no trouble at all. Mrs. Leonard declared, "I wouldn't say any of us were drunk. I'm sure Whitey wasn't, but I don't remember Mrs. Atkins saying anything or even ordering a beer or anything to eat. She seemed to be dazed." Unquote. Brady said the only time he remembered Mrs. Atkins saying anything was when he danced with her and stepped on her feet. Quote, "After we left Mrs. Leonard off, Whitey suggested a farm he knew. I never saw it before. We went straight there from Mrs. Leonard's. Whitey drove. We went up a driveway to the back of the house and got out. I tried the back door, but it was locked. Then Whitey and Mrs. Atkins went around front. I didn't go with them, but I heard glass break. I just went back and sat in the car. I didn't go in the place at all. Whitey went in there with Mrs. Atkins. They were there about 15 minutes or half an hour. All I heard the whole time was a shuffle of feet. After a while, I went inside and met Whitey coming downstairs. Whitey said, I bopped her. His hand was cut and there was blood on his shirt. I wanted to go up and get Mrs. Atkins, but Whitey grabbed me. Then he said, we better go home. Unquote. On the way home, Brady said, the only conversation between the two men was Whitey's single sentence, I should have bopped her again. 34 police photographs of the farmhouse near the body, the scene of the slaying, were shown to the jurors as evidence of the brutality of the slaying. Included were the steel bedpost, the heavy curtain pole, and the coat hanger that were used to beat Mrs. Atkins and rip at her mouth. December 5th, 1940. In a dramatic confession in open court at Norristown, William J. Ernest admitted yesterday he killed Edith Angier Atkins in a drunken rage, but said he didn't mean to do it. Face contorted, sobbing, Ernest broke down and the trial had to be halted after he screamed, I hit her, don't ask me any more, I can't take it, I hit her. His confession came as a climax to 90 minutes of direct examination. But the 35-year-old Philadelphia short-order cook returned to the stand after a 5-minute recess ordered by Judge William F. Danahauer. He was as composed as when he began his lurid story on the third day of his trial for the brutal slaying of Mrs. Atkins. He admitted that Mrs. Atkins resisted his advances when he brought her to the lonely farmhouse after finding her at 8 a.m. in a bar at 20th Street below Burke's. He exonerated Richard W. Brady, his companion on the long beer-drinking debauch which preceded the savage slugging of Mrs. Atkins, and repeated his declaration he had been driven to savage rage by the woman herself. He denied the testimony of Brady and Miss Catherine Leonard, who had been in the party earlier in the morning, that Mrs. Atkins was dazed from drink, in a coma, unable to talk. Instead, the blond-haired man with the powerful shoulders said she taunted him after he had coaxed her upstairs. Describing the struggle with the woman, he said, Oh, the pain was awful. Everything went black. I fell on my side. I fainted. I came to. She was standing over me with a stick. I managed to stand up and get the stick. Everything went black, but I didn't mean to kill her. Then I hit her. I hit her a lot. I hit her on the head. I hit her. She fell on the floor. I don't know what I did. I ran out when I seen what I had done. Unquote. His final outburst, resulting in the recess, followed as his voice rose in a steady crescendo of, I hit her. 37 gruesome photographs have been shown to the jury, showing the terrible result of his fury. Ernest, called Whitey because of a patch of white hair, is himself the father of 2 children and has a police record involving both a statutory charge with a 12-year-old boy and stealing his grandmother's wedding ring. He was cross-examined for 25 minutes by District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley, who frequently tripped him on details of the 3 separate confessions he made to police, 2 of which were admitted as evidence. Ernest said he had 32 beers and 2 whiskeys in the 14 hours before the murder. December 6, 1940. William J. Ernest, his body racking with loud sobs, heard a jury of 7 men and 5 women condemn him last night to the electric chair for the brutal slaying of Mrs. Ethel Atkins. A verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree with the death penalty recommended was returned by the jury in the Montgomery County Courthouse at 10:35 p.m. Such a verdict left Judge William F. Danahauer with no alternative than to sentence Ernest to death in the electric chair at Rockview Penitentiary. The verdict came only 4 days after the trial had begun, and only 69 days after Ernest was arrested for the gruesome killing described by District Attorney Frederick B. Smiley as the most heinous ever committed in Montgomery County. It was delivered in an almost empty courtroom 5 hours after the case had been given to the jury. Only a score of men and women were in the spectators section when the jury walked in. Clerk of Court Arthur George asked the jurors if they had decided the fate of the defendant. "We have," replied William H. Frangenfield, 42-year-old Green Lane father of 4 children, handing over the verdict to George. George opened it and read, his booming words echoing through the room. "The verdict of the jury is guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation of the death penalty." At the word death, Ernest nearly collapsed. He tugged at his rear pocket for a handkerchief, meanwhile bursting out with a series of loud sobs. William Fox, court-appointed defense counsel, immediately asked that the jury be polled. Fulfillment of his motion served merely to confirm a dozen times that the jury, as a group, had reported. Fox then made the customary motion for a stay of judgment until reasons for a new trial could be presented. The usual 5 days were granted by Judge Danahauer. By 11 o'clock, the courtroom was empty, the jurors gone, and Ernest, his sobs echoing now through the county jail, back in his cell. In the courtroom, as the verdict was announced, was James Francis Atkins, husband of the dead mother of 5 children. He showed no emotion as the clerk read the decision of the jury. Later, he said that justice has been done in dealing with this fiend and brute. When Atkins attempted to thank Smiley for what he had done, the district attorney interrupted, "Don't thank me. There are some of us here who are not very happy this evening." It was obvious that Smiley had undergone great emotional stress in presenting the Commonwealth's successful case. A juror said afterward that only 2 ballots were taken, one to eliminate a second-degree verdict and the other to find him guilty of murder of the first degree with death recommended. Thus ended, barring appeals and technicalities, the judicial process in a crime which, for its shocking details, had few equals. October 27th, 1941. William J. Whitey Ernest paid with his life early today for the murder of Miss Ethel May Atkins last year. The 36-year-old short-order cook died in the electric chair at the Western State Penitentiary near Bellefonte. He paid the penalty calmly and silently, a few minutes short of 1 a.m. Ernest's last hour of life was spent reading a prayer book in his cell at Rockview's death house. He chain-smoked his cigarettes, but that was the only sign of nervousness. At 12:34 a.m., he shook off even that trace of concern and began the 40-foot walk to the chair with head erect, eyes straight ahead. As he sat in the chair and the electrodes were adjusted, no word was said. 3 minutes after the switch was closed, the prison physicians pronounced him dead. Yesterday, he made no special requests and ate the regular prison food. He had no visitors except Raymond F. McCreesh, Catholic clergyman at the prison, who walked the last lap with him. Penitentiary officials said that he appeared resigned to his death and had slept very well on Saturday night. That was A Fatal Drinking Party, the brutal murder of Ethel May Atkins. Culled from the historic pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer and other newspapers of the era. True Crime Historian is a creation of popular media. Or you can support your favorite podcaster, me, at www.patreon.com/truecrimehistorian. Just $1 a month reserves your bunk at the safe house and gives you access to exclusive content and whatever personal services you require. Opening theme by Nico Vitesi. Closing theme by Dave Sams and Rachel Schott, engineered by David Hish at 3rd Street Music. Media management by Sean R. Miller-Jones. And me, I do everything else around here. I'm true crime historian Richard O. Jones, signing off for now.